In 1921, a regular army of 50,000 men, equipped with heavy artillery, armored vehicles, and aircraft, was dispatched to an agricultural province in central Russia. Their enemy was not foreign invaders, not the remnants of the White Army. It was their own country's peasants. These peasants were encircled in the forest. The regular army commander issued a formal written order to deploy asphyxiating gas shells, saturating the woods. Military engineers precisely calculated the dispersal range, ensuring the gas would spread beneath every branch into the lungs of every person hiding there. Note the date, 1921. 20 full years before the Nazis used gas chambers. And the regime that issued this gas order called itself the Worker-Peasant Alliance. Today, we're going to talk about the massive peasant uprising that erupted in Tambov province between 1920 and 1921. This event is one of the most ironic and most spine-chilling tragedies in early Soviet history. A regime that claimed to represent workers and peasants deployed the full arsenal of war, including chemical weapons, to systematically crush the very peasants who were supposed to be one of the foundations of its rule. Not appeasement, not negotiation, not reflection, gas. The root cause of this rebellion was extremely simple. Simple enough to sum up in 4 words. They couldn't survive anymore. At the time, though the Russian Civil War was drawing to a close, the main White Army forces had been largely crushed by late 1920, and foreign intervention troops were gradually withdrawing. The Bolshevik policy of war communism was not being relaxed with the war's end. It was being intensified. And the core, the most lethal component of this policy, was Prodrazvyorska, the grain requisitioning system. The name sounded like it only took the surplus grain that peasants couldn't finish eating. You kept your own food. You kept next year's seeds. Only what was left went to the state. It sounded almost fair, but in reality, it was nothing like that. The requisition quotas were not calculated from actual harvest reports across the regions. They were decided top-down by officials in Moscow offices. How much the frontline army needed, how much the urban workers needed, add those 2 numbers together, and that was the amount you had to deliver. How much land your family had, whether it had been a drought year or a flood year, how much grain your fields had actually yielded, how many mouths you had to feed, none of these fell within the scope of the calculation. The armed requisition squads, they were not grain administrators coming to negotiate with you. They were armed men carrying rifles and pistols swept through the countryside like locusts, over and over again. They carried non-negotiable orders and hard quotas from above. They not only took the so-called surplus, they often forcibly seized the food that kept a peasant family alive, and the seeds for next year's planting. Not a single sack of wheat left behind, not a single seed remaining. Any peasant who tried to resist or hide grain was immediately branded a kulak and a counter-revolutionary, arrested on the spot, or even summarily executed right there. This marrow-sucking plunder, combined with the continuous pressure of forced conscription, every round of conscription meant a family lost its main labor, and losing labor meant it was even harder to grow enough grain the next year to meet the new quotas, finally drove the peasants of Tambov past the breaking point. They picked up hunting rifles, pitchforks, axes, and whatever crude weapons they could find. They formed a rebel force, calling themselves the Blue Army. Their leader was a local peasant, Alexander Antonov. He was not a professional revolutionary sent from Moscow, not an intellectual writing theoretical articles. He was a Tambov native, the son of a peasant, who had seen with his own eyes how the requisition squads treated his people. The slogan shouted by the rebel army under Antonov's leadership was so precise it was heartbreaking. They didn't shout down with the Soviets. They didn't shout restore the Tsar. They didn't shout bring in foreign intervention. What they shouted was down with the FA. Requisition squads. Long live the Soviets, but no communists. What this meant was, we are not against Soviets as a form of organization. Workers and peasants should have power. What we oppose is what the Communist Party is doing to us in that name. The requisition squads were sent by you, so we fight the requisition squads. The ideal of Soviets itself is not wrong. You are. This clearly showed that their grievances were directed at specific policies and their enforcers, not at the Soviet regime itself. They were not counter-revolutionaries. They were anti-requisition. The rebellion spread rapidly. Once the peasants' years of pent-up rage found an outlet, it was like a dam bursting. At its peak, Antonov's Blue Army numbered in the tens of thousands and controlled vast swathes of rural Tambov province. They used their intimate knowledge of the local forests and terrain to wage a flexible guerrilla war. They raided requisition squad outposts, ambushed small Red Army units, sabotaged railways and communication lines. Regular army units were sent to suppress them, but these soldiers from the cities couldn't find their bearings in the dense forests. Time and again, Red Army clearing operations got lost, bogged down and suffered heavy losses in the woods and swamps. Faced with this rebellion by the very class it claimed to represent, the Soviet regime's reaction, please note, was not reflection. It wasn't. Have we gone too far? Even the peasants are rebelling? It wasn't. Let's send a delegation to negotiate with the rebels, hear their demands, see if we can make some policy adjustments. The Soviet regime's reaction was decisive, total military annihilation. In 1921, Lenin personally appointed one of the Red Army's most brilliant commanders, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, with full authority over the suppression campaign. This appointment itself said everything. Tukhachevsky was no ordinary division or corps commander. He was one of the Red Army's most renowned strategists, famous for commanding large-scale formations and launching decisive offensives. Sending him to deal with a bunch of peasants armed with hunting rifles and pitchforks was like using a heavy howitzer to kill a sparrow, but Lenin and Tukhachevsky didn't see it that way. In their eyes, Tambov was not an agricultural province needing appeasement, it was enemy territory needing to be conquered. The rebel peasants were not victims of policy who needed to be understood. They were an enemy army that needed to be annihilated. Tukhachevsky mobilized over 50,000 troops. He brought armored trains, heavy artillery, and reconnaissance aircraft. He planned this military operation against his own country's peasants as if it were a formal, modern military campaign with operational maps, forced deployment plans, and phased offensive timetables. To deal with the guerrillas hiding in the forests, the Red Army adopted a series of extremely brutal and entirely systematic clearing strategies. These strategies were not the uncontrolled behavior of individual soldiers, they were official policy, written down in orders. First, the hostage system. The families of rebels, parents, wives, children were dragged from their homes and held in custody. If the rebels didn't surrender, the hostages were executed. This was publicly announced policy, not isolated incidents. Second, scorched earth clearing. The entire populations of villages were driven into temporary concentration camps. These were just open-air enclosures surrounded by barbed wire, with no adequate food, water, or medical care. Then, Red Army soldiers burned those villages to the ground, along with the crops and all property inside them. The only goal, cut off every source of food, shelter, and intelligence for the guerrillas. Third, indiscriminate reprisal. For any village suspected of providing food or intelligence to the rebels, Red Army soldiers were ordered to carry out retaliatory fire, not precision strikes, not arrests of suspects, but shooting at the entire village. These three together meant, if you were a peasant in Tambov province, you didn't need to join the rebellion, or even support it, you only needed to live in a region where rebels might pass through. And you were already a legitimate target. Your village could be burned, your family could be taken as hostages, you yourself could be shot indiscriminately. And then, on the 12th of June 1921, Tukhachevsky signed an order that made everything before it pale in comparison. The main content of this order, I am now quoting its actual wording, was, for the bandits holding out in the forests and stubbornly resisting, clear them out using asphyxiating gas shells. Calculate the gas dispersal range precisely, ensuring the complete elimination of all personnel hiding within. Yes, 20 full years before the Nazis used gas chambers for genocide, this regime that called itself a worker-peasant state had already used chemical weapons against its own peasants. Red Army engineering units were dispatched to the forests where rebels were holding out. They didn't just casually toss in a few gas shells, they followed formal chemical warfare operating procedures. They precisely calculated the wind direction, wind speed, and gas dispersal range. They chose the timing of deployment to ensure that the forest mist, the kind that settles under the leaves before dawn, would trap the gas, preventing the wind from dispersing it, letting it linger among the trees for a long, long time. The gas shells they use contain chlorine and other chemical agents. Chlorine is heavier than air. It sinks to the ground, fills every depression and hollow, seeps into every crude cellar and dugout. When the gas filled the entire forest area, every person inside the rebels, their families, the elderly, women, and children hiding in the woods was suffocated or poisoned to death. Chlorine burns the respiratory tract. The lungs fill with fluid. The victim essentially drowns in their own body fluids. The goal of this order was not merely military victory. Its architects knew perfectly well that the direct military effect of the gas shells killing a few hundred guerrillas in a patch of forest was far outweighed by the psychological impact it would generate. Its true function was to send a signal. Any thought of resistance would be destroyed, physically and spiritually, in the most terrifying way you could possibly imagine. No hiding place is safe. The forest cannot protect you. The earth cannot protect you. The very air you breathe can be turned by the state into a weapon that kills you. This suppression was efficient and thorough. By the summer of 1921, the rebellion was completely crushed. Antonov himself was tracked down and killed in combat the following year. Tens of thousands of rebel peasants were summarily executed during and after the fighting, dragged to walls, to the edges of woods, to freshly dug pits, and mowed down with machine guns. Over 50,000 people were thrown into those temporary concentration camps. The conditions in these camps, no adequate food, no medicine, no clothing or bedding to withstand the cold, were, in themselves, a form of slow-motion execution. Within these camps, around 15,000 people died under the appalling conditions. Died of starvation, died of typhus, died of the bitter winter cold, died of the guards' arbitrary brutality. The tragedy of the Tambov rebellion tore away any shred of warmth or compassion still clinging to the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat. It laid one thing utterly bare. When the interests of any group, even the group that, in theory, was supposed to be most represented by this regime, the group written into its very name, printed on every propaganda poster, invoked in every speech, came into conflict with the party's absolute power and the policies it enforced, the party would not hesitate. It would choose to defend itself with the most extreme and brutal violence available. The act of using poison gas to suppress its own peasants became an eternal metaphor. It symbolized that this regime, whose slogans were filled with liberation, equality, the people, had, from its very earliest days, already set out on a path of no return, a path that made it the enemy of the very people it claimed to represent. The chlorine gas drifting through the forests of Tambov revealed this essence earlier and more starkly than many of the things that would later happen in the Gulag.